Now that pre-flight of the mode control panel is complete, let's use it to fly a typical flight profile. Let's begin from position hold at the end of the active runway. Since we pre-armed LNAV and VNAV during pre-flight, we'll use these two modes for initial navigation and climb-out. During climb-out in cruise, we'll show you some other modes you could also use. The Flight Director pitch command is in the parked position at 8 degrees. Do not use this as the target attitude for initial rotation. Pushing either toga switch engages the autothrottle and autopilot flight director system in either takeoff mode or go-around mode, depending on the phase of flight. The toga switches tell the autoflight system to engage autothrottle, roll, and pitch in the toga mode. The toga mode is used for takeoff and go-around. OK, you've been cleared for takeoff and have advanced the thrust levers to 1.05 EPR. Push either toga switch to engage the autothrottle for takeoff. The autothrottle engages in thrust reference to advance the thrust levers to takeoff thrust. Whenever thrust reference enunciates, the thrust levers advance to the selected limit. The takeoff thrust limit is selected in the CDU during pre-flight. This is discussed later. With thrust reference engaged, moving the thrust levers requires a constant overriding force of the autothrottle servos. As soon as the thrust levers are released, the autothrottle positions them back to the selected limit. At 80 knots, the autothrottle enunciation changes to hold. With hold enunciated, power is removed from the autothrottle. The thrust levers can now be manually positioned without interference from the autothrottle. Let's quickly review takeoff, assisted by the autoflight system. After rotation at VR, allow the Flight Director pitch bar to stabilize at initial climb attitude before following its commands. In takeoff mode, the Flight Director adjusts the pitch command to maintain an airspeed V2 plus 15 knots. The Flight Director pitch bar commands the speed at rotation plus 15 knots if rotation occurs at a speed higher than V2. However, the commanded speed will not exceed V2 plus 25 knots. The toga roll mode commands the track established during the takeoff roll. With LNAV armed, it engages at 50 feet. LNAV mode gives roll commands to fly the flight plan route. This lateral route is constructed by the FMC, which is based on the flight plan you entered into the FMC during pre-flight. FMC route entry is discussed in another lesson. With VNAV armed, it engages at 400 feet. When VNAV engages, the IAS Mach window blanks, indicating that the FMC is now controlling airspeed. Just like LNAV, VNAV commands are computed by the FMC. With LNAV and VNAV engaged, the airplane flies the most economical lateral and vertical paths possible. The FMC route accounts for factors such as fuel costs, operational costs, and weather conditions. Performance factors are entered during pre-flight and also in-flight. This is covered later. Let's review the takeoff again up to this point. Up to now, you have been manually flying the airplane using the flight directors for guidance. The autopilot is always ready for some stick time. There are two autopilot engage switches. Use either one to engage the autopilot. Autopilot enunciates, confirming the autopilot engaged. The autopilot engages in the same roll and pitch modes that were being used by the flight directors. The flight director command bars are still displayed for reference. Now let's see how flight level change mode is used for making climbs and descents. Let's begin by using flight level change instead of VNAV to continue the climb. The first step of any altitude change is to set the new altitude into the MCP altitude window. The second step is to initiate the altitude change by engaging the desired mode, in this case, flight level change. The IAS Mach window opens. Set to the FMC selected airspeed. You can now set airspeed manually. Thrust and flight level change speed enunciate for autothrottle and pitch. With thrust enunciated, the autothrottle sets thrust based on the required altitude change. If the altitude change is small, then the amount of thrust increase is small. If the altitude change is large, the amount of thrust increase is large. In fact, the thrust increase could be up to the climb limit. The autothrottle sets thrust to maintain a target vertical speed. The greater the altitude change, the greater the target vertical speed. When speed appears with the pitch enunciation, pitch controls airspeed. So airplane pitch is adjusted to maintain the speed selected in the IAS Mach window. Passing through transition altitude, accelerate to climb speed. The FMC shows the Econ climb speed. Set the climb speed on the MCP. The autopilot adjusts pitch to accelerate to the new speed. Thrust remains constant. Now let's look at level off, beginning with altitude alerts. An altitude alert occurs when within 900 feet of the MCP altitude. A box appears around the selected altitude, and the box around the current altitude becomes bold. The display remains this way until within 200 feet of the MCP altitude. Within 200 feet of the MCP altitude, the displays return to normal. After level off, an altitude deviation alert occurs 200 feet away from the MCP altitude. The PFD altitude box changes to amber, along with the ICAS alert message, master caution, and caution beeper. The caution clears when the airplane returns to within 200 feet of the selected altitude. Or descends more than 900 feet from the selected altitude. When approaching the MCP altitude, altitude automatically engages. The autothrottle engages in speed and now controls airspeed. After level off, the selected altitude is maintained and both the autothrottle and the pitch enunciations remain the same. You may have noticed a pattern with the thrust and pitch modes. Almost always, one mode controls airspeed, while the other mode controls the vertical path. The enunciation speed indicates which mode is controlling airspeed. In this case, Autothrottle controls airspeed. Therefore, pitch maintains the vertical path or altitude. In flight level change, the modes are reversed. Autothrottle controls the vertical path, while pitch controls airspeed. To help illustrate the difference, set the FMC recommended econ speed for cruise into the MCP. Since the thrust mode is speed, the thrust levers advance to accelerate the airplane to the new airspeed. Pitch changes very slightly to maintain altitude at the new airspeed. Speed changes can also be made using Mach number. Change the MCP to display Mach number. The MCP and the speed tape both display commanded Mach number. Enter the new Mach number into the MCP. Now let's look at how the altitude hold switch can be used. It can be used to interrupt a climb or descent. Use flight level change to descend to the new cruise altitude. Touch the highlighted area. If altitude hold is pushed, the airplane initiates a level off to the altitude where the hold switch was pushed. Use altitude hold to comply with the clearance. Speed and altitude appear again for the thrust and pitch modes. The Autoflight system immediately terminates the descent and levels off. Continue the descent to flight level 210 using flight level change. Now let's see how to use the autopilot to comply with radar vectors from ATC. During pre-flight, the heading selector was used to set the takeoff runway heading. Set the clearance heading. Heading Select is engaged by pushing the Heading Select switch. The Heading Select switch is located on the end of the heading selector. Push the Heading Select switch to engage the Heading Select roll mode. Heading Select enunciates on the PFD, and the airplane turns the shortest direction to the selected heading. Once Track Select or Heading Select is engaged, turning the heading selector to a new heading turns the airplane in the direction the selector knob was turned. Now let's use Track Select mode to comply with this clearance. Now that the ND is set with the appropriate VOR and course, switch to Track Select mode. Notice the MCP window and PFD enunciation changed to the newly selected mode. Also, notice the airplane is still flying the same heading. The only change that occurred is the MCP window changing to the airplane's track, and the bugs on the 2 compass cards also moving to the airplane's track. Now it's time to begin the turn onto the 310-degree radial. Select a track of 130 degrees. Notice the autopilot rolled the airplane out on the heading that is required for maintaining a track of 130 degrees. Should LNAV fail, it's fairly easy to continue flying the LNAV track using Track Select mode. By using Track Select mode, a desired ground track can easily be maintained without having to guess at headings and wind correction angles. Now let's look at the heading track hold switch. Pushing the heading track hold switch engages the heading hold or track hold mode. Engage the track hold mode. The current heading or track is maintained. If in a turn when the mode is engaged, the airplane first rolls wings level, then holds its current heading or track. The maximum bank angle used in the heading and track roll modes can be adjusted to any of these settings. The bank limit selector functions the heading and track select modes only. It has no effect on LNAV. The bank limit selector is the outermost rotary selector. It is used to set the bank limit. In auto, the maximum bank varies depending on true airspeed. Comply with the clearance. First, change the heading track reference to heading. Set the maximum bank angle to 10 degrees. Set the bank limit selector back to auto. At the present speed, auto sets the bank to 25 degrees. Changing the bank limit during a turn simply increases or decreases the turn rate. Now let's look at some of the autothrottle controls. There are 2 ways of disconnecting the autothrottle. You can position the autothrottle arm switches to the off position, or you can push an autothrottle disconnect switch. An autothrottle disconnect switch is located on each side of the thrust levers. Either switch disengages both servos. If disconnected by the autothrottle arm switches, the autothrottle is no longer armed. None of the autothrottle modes are available. If disconnected by the autothrottle disconnect switch, the autothrottle remains armed. Pushing flight level change, VNAV or TOGA, engages the autothrottle, or by pushing the autothrottle engage switch, the autothrottle engages in the mode appropriate to the currently engaged pitch mode. Now disconnect the autothrottle by using an autothrottle disconnect switch. Push the switch a second time to reset the master caution system and cancel the ICAS message. Now that the autothrottle is disengaged, the thrust levers can be moved without interference from the autothrottle. Retard the thrust levers to idle. The thrust levers remain where you set them. Now re-engage the autothrottle by pushing the autothrottle engage switch. The autothrottle engages in the mode appropriate to the currently engaged pitch mode. In this case, since altitude is the engaged pitch mode, the autothrottle engages in the speed mode. This completes the instruction.